Hello, everyone, and welcome to another author interview here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe. And today we have another author, another Californian author, which is awesome. I'm so excited to meet so many California authors here on the show. It's really, really exciting. And I'm so excited to share with you all their book here on the channel. Now, a little bit about my guest. The world was dull and unimaginative for my guest growing up in the 1970s in Southern California. He found a creative outlet in the world of Marvel Comics, fervidly devouring the monthly adventures of Iron Man, Hulk, and Captain America. Later, his taste turned towards Marvel's black and white magazines, more eccentric horror province, faithfully following titles such as Dracula Lives and Tales of the Zombie. Influenced by these works and such great authors such as Bram Stoker, Steakley, and Marv Wolfman, my guest's unique writing style combines horror and fantasy elements with superhero style action. My guest spends his time reading, exercising at the gym, adding to his model collection, or walking his two dogs when he's not writing. And as I said before, he lives in California with his wife and son. And today we will be discussing a book that is arguably probably the most unique vampire story I have ever heard. If you haven't heard of it, well, let's give a huge round of applause to the author who will be telling us all about this story and more. Today's guest, Mr. Scott Harper. Scott, thank you so much for coming on the show this morning.
Thanks, Gabriel. It's great to be here. I'm excited to share my journey with you and your audience.
Awesome, Scott. So before we dive into your novel, is there anything else you'd like to add about your bio, or will we find that out later in the interview?
No, I'm sure we'll delve into it. Basically, I'm a speculative fiction writer, but my main interest in fiction is vampires, and most of my books and short stories deal with vampires to one degree or another. I'm fascinated by the whole motive of life beyond death and powers beyond human, that whole genre. I think I got started with my interest in superheroes when I was younger, but I'm sure we'll dive into all that.
Awesome. And speaking of your novels and short stories, can you give our audience a little teaser into your short stories as well as your novel, Anton the Ultimate?
Sure. I've been writing short stories for a number of years, fortunate to get a number of them published. And I've got a few collections of short stories now, two-volume Lethal Lords and Lady of the Night. It's 46 short stories, all with vampires and different settings, fantasy and sci-fi and horror. And then I also have the Ultimate Anton collection, which is about our vampire gladiator turned vampire, Anton the Undying, and his adventures over the last 2 millennia.
Wow. And honestly, viewers and listeners, when I first heard that, the idea of a Roman gladiator turning into a vampire, I instantly had to get Scott on the show because I want to know like how this story came about. But before we dive into Anton and the world that Anton resides in, let's actually dive into our guest a little bit more. So, Scott, as you said, you've been writing short stories for a very long time, and you were, reading, the Marvel comics, the monthly magazines of Iron Man, Hulk, Captain America. So, would you say growing up that you were a creative person, or was that later in life?
Let's say I always had the inclination to the creative. I remember in 8th grade, my English teacher had us start a journal, and you had to write something every day. So I found, the experiences at school pretty humdrum. So I would decide to write ongoing zombie story based on a movie read about. I didn't even see it till many years later, called Sugar Hill, not the one with Wesley Snipes. It's about a it's about a club owner, nightclub owner who gets murdered, and his wife or fiance, Marky Post is the actor. No, I'm sorry, I forgot the name. She basically enlists voodoo to take revenge on the people that killed her husband, and it's raises a bunch of zombies. So I decided I wanted to do a story similar to that. And my journal entries back in like 1982, you can guess my age now, but was doing journal entries, and that was the start. And then took a break. We all have a life to live and put food on the table and start a family. And then around 1997, I started to write stories again, and I got them published in a small press. I think they call them zines. It's basically a token payment called The Vampire's Crypt. And I got a few stories published. And then about a decade later, I actually had my first real success of getting a little bit of money paid for something. And that was kind of a weird story. I got a prose story published in a comic book called 30 Days of Night Bloodsucker Tales, which is, 30 Days of Night, Steve Niles. There was a movie with Josh Hartnett, I think, and it was based on a graphic novel. And the graphic novel spun off a bunch of comic books. And I remember seeing that there were short stories at the back about vampires, but not necessarily set in the 30 Days of Night universe. So I sent a story I'd written to their editor. I think his name was Chris Ryle. And I think he gave me like $100 in 2005. That was by far the most I'd ever been paid for anything. So that kind of got me interested in writing for people, trying to market it a little bit. So over the years, when I had time, I'd write some stories, and they'd occasionally get published. I got published in small press, like Weird Book, Space and Time, Society for Misfit Stories. So, and then gradually over time, I had accumulated a lot of publications and a lot of stories, and that led to novellas and collections.
Awesome. Now, how did Anton come about? And regarding Anton, what was the aha moment for you when you wanted to push yourself even more, that you wanted to continue down this path?
I'd always been fascinated with the concept of an immortal warrior, and I thought I'd try and take the greatest human warrior of all time and give him the powers of a vampire, and then see what happened, and then let him age, grow to be an extremely old vampire. So we take Dracula in Stoker's novel. He's approximately 500 years old when that story's going on, and he's got the strength of 20 men and can do all these things. I thought, what would it be like to have a 2,000-year-old plus vampire? What could he do? And
Okay.
I'd also kind of experiment. I'd seen bits and pieces where vampires would feed on other superheroes or other creatures and get more power from that blood, like say drink a werewolf's blood, and what would happen. So my character Anton, over the time, he becomes obsessed with gaining power through the drinking different types of blood. But basically, Anton gestated in the idea of the greatest warrior and immortal warrior and his adventures over time. And my publisher, Input Output, I had dealt with them a little bit. They had published a couple of my stories in anthologies. I think I'd written a Jack the Ripper story with a vampire in it. So they were I go on the Horror Tree or other places to see who's publishing, and Input Output was looking for serial stories. So I had done 6,000 words. I decided, well, let's try a novella. So I came up with the first Anton story, The Name of Fear, which has a little bit of Anton's background in the Third Servile War in Rome, and also his current existence as kind of an enforcer for the supernatural community, for creatures that break the code and expose themselves, make themselves known. So basically, I created a novella, sent it into Input Output. They liked it and wanted more. So the first collection ended up being 2 novellas and a short story. And that got published as The Name of Fear. And that led to further collections.
Wow. Now I have to finish reading Anton, because I am like so intrigued of how he almost sounds like he's like as you said, he's this individual who represents the supernatural community, but he's kind of like the keeper of the balance, where the mortal world doesn't know the supernatural and the supernatural cannot reveal themselves to the mortal world. That is a very, very interesting. And also, what would the world look like to him as time goes on, from a Roman gladiator turned to a vampire, seeing time go on into the late antiquities, early, middle to late medieval ages, and just into the modern, pre-modern world. It's a very fascinating concept. And it's also, when we think of vampires, we don't really think of set in the Roman era. We think of vampires in like medieval or pre-modern era, but vampire lore in Roman mythology is, or even just Roman history, is a very unique concept. I think the only time I've ever heard of something like that was actually in the TV show The Strain, where they had the barbarian gladiator who was a form of vampire, and the Romans figured out, we're going to use you as a soldier, and you're going to kill our enemies, and as payment, you can feast upon our enemies to satisfy. So that's a very, very fascinating and unique twist and concept for the vampire mythos. So now let's actually dive into creating Anton and your other short stories. So when you began writing your short stories, as well as when you began writing Anton, what are some goals that you set out for yourself as an author, but also what are your goals and promises you are making to your prospective readers?
I had a certain type of story I wanted to communicate. I basically wanted to take a comic book or a pulp type fiction and put it into words, knowing that I wouldn't have pictures necessarily to go along with it. So my promise to my audience is that you will not be bored. You might find better writers, but there's lots of action going on, and I try my best to keep it coherent with a plot and to have it go somewhere. So tons of action, lots of vampire myth and mythology. I really get into the how the vampires are created and their timeline, and going back into like barbarian times. I find that whole concept of what is keeping a living corpse going, the dark magic, sorcery, whatever you want to call it. What's behind that? So basically, I would like to keep my readers content. And Anton's got, by the final collection, he's got over 500 pages of story. So hopefully that they enjoy it and will want to keep going through all 500 pages.
Nice. And I know I'm going to read like all 500, because I want to see how the world is going to react to him and how he's going to react to the world, not just as a vampire, but as a being from a past and a world that no longer exists. So, also speaking on your readers, I don't know if you did this back in the day, or even if these were uh, ideas back in the day, but when you finished writing the first draft of also your short stories and also for Anton, what was the initial reaction like? Was it positive, negative, or somewhere in the middle? And has that changed from when you first began in the 80s and 90s and to now with new readers, since now the vampire mythos has expanded with new books, movies, and TV shows?
Yeah, basically, once you have someone that's interested in your work, you can tailor it to a little bit what they like and what you like. So I was writing stuff that I liked, and then I would see if it could get published, and that way, if somebody published it, I could see somebody else likes it. So my basic thing is I want to write what I want to write, but if somebody else isn't interested in it, then it's not really that good. So that's why I always go through a publisher, have somebody that can send a couple of editors to look at the work, send it out to a couple of readers to get input. And that's what happened with Anton. They were looking for a serial action series, and I sent it in, and we hashed it out, a couple of rewrites, and got something that they felt was presentable. And here we are.
Nice. And from those reactions and interactions with your readers and fans over the years, would you agree that they have, in a way, validated your goals, as you mentioned earlier, which was, telling a very cohesive story that's action-packed but very gripping?
Yeah, so far the reaction has been pretty good. Um, we've been the current Anton book contains the other two collections. So we've actually, my wife and I do a lot of selling of the books at local conventions in California. So we see sometimes people come back and give me a feedback on it. And so far, the reaction's been very positive. I have big muscle guys that like the action. I have female readers that are interested in a little bit of the side romances, and also the just the vampire concept in general. People that like 30 Days of Night, or just the old Bram Stoker's Dracula, Interview with the Vampire, all sorts of different takes on the vampires. They generally all enjoy my take on them so far, from what I've seen in the reviews I've gotten.
That's awesome. That's really, really good. And that actually leads into the next question, which is the first reflective question. Now, as I'm sure you definitely will agree, Scott, writing a book is not a get rich quick money scheme. It's years and years of honing the story, developing it, sometimes redeveloping it to get to the point that okay, this is the final version. Not to mention also, cover artists, editors, finding a printing press, then also a publisher, and then getting it formatted the way you want it. And now with the digital age, it allows more authors to showcase their work. But also because of the digital age, there's now a heightened sense of anxiety and hesitancy, in the sense of, is this book going to be received well or not? And of course, imposter syndrome is very, very apparent now more than ever because of the internet and social media, that it could be a deal breaker, or in this case, topic of vampires, nail in the coffin for authors and their careers going forward. So for you, Scott, when you began writing your short stories and also began writing the Anton series, did you ever have that sense of hesitancy, in the sense that, are people going to be open-minded to this character in the vampire lore? And also, what has disciplined you to continue writing the stories that you want to share and tell with the rest of the world?
But yeah, I've been writing for a while, and I've had my share of rejects. And actually, the rejects far outnumber the acceptances. And I think that's common for most younger writers or
Mm.
people starting out. I'm not young, don't get me wrong, but you get a lot of rejection. But for every 5, 6 rejections, you get one acceptance, somebody that really likes it. And that's kind of keeps me going. And having a publisher behind you, like Input Output or Sinister Smile for the Lethal Lords, willing to help you edit, help market, and even and pay you, that reinforces the drive to create. And when you write, you already know this, you tear off a little piece of yourself and you put it in a computer or you put it in print. So if that gets rejected, sometimes it's hard to not take that personally. But after time, if you keep honing and you learn from your mistakes, at some point you're going to succeed, even if it's a small level. And usually for me, that's enough to keep going.
Definitely. You know what? That is very, very true, because you do take a little piece of yourself and you input it into the story. In fact, I've had one guest actually last night give something very, very similar, Sabrina Vorman, who said that whenever we write our stories, we're inputting a little bit of ourselves into the work. But she also said one thing is important, especially for new writers: never have your project tied to your self-worth as a person and as an author. That is never a good thing, because, I just said, for every rejection, there's one acceptance. Like, never compare your self-worth to your book. If people do not like your book, that's completely fine. It may not be for them. And it will lead to other people liking your work. And it's just, honing your craft as time goes on, trying to find your voice as an author. And funnily enough, that leads now into the business side of being an author, which I'm very interested to hear your thoughts on these questions, Scott. So, as a little icebreaker, as you've already mentioned, that your publisher for your short stories and Anton is Input and Output. Now, looking back on the success of being published through Input Output, is there anything that you would have done differently when you started publications, or is there nothing you would change?
Yeah, there's a lot I would change. When you're dealing with small press, uh, you have to do a lot of the promotion on your own. So the first time I got published, I thought, okay, they'll handle everything. I'll put out a little bit on Facebook and that'll be great. And I've learned that it probably requires more than that. Fortunately for me, Input Output has been taking ads on Amazon. And I recently learned about taking ads on Facebook and Instagram just recently within the last couple of weeks. And from what I can tell, that seems to get more attention. And basically, at my level, you have to do about half of the work, which is fine. Uh, I'm happy to get published and get paid for it. Somebody's willing to buy it. And if that's up to me to market it on certain platforms or to go to conventions and sell my books in person, which I do, and I'm more than willing to do that. So, long story short, you have to work, you have to put in the work. You can't just assume just because the book's in print somewhere that people are going to see it and buy it. Like, I remember my first conventions, gentleman came up to me and we had the books on display and he's reading. He goes, "This was really good." And then he says, "I can't find it on Amazon because it didn't go in the algorithm." So he was searching like vampires and it didn't pop up. So there's a lot involved in it. I'm relative newbie. Actually having my own books published This is the last couple of years, and each day I learned something different. So my final advice, well, not final, but you got to work. you gotta invest a little bit. Like some of the money you get, or some of your saved up money, you got to market it. You got to put it out there. Otherwise, people won't see it.
That is very, very true. And also, for me as an indie author, that is very, 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 very true because, when we self-publish, it's on us. The marketing, getting the word out there, we have to be consistent. Not to say you have to make 30 posts to get it for a month. That's impossible. Some people could do it. I myself am not that very savvy when it comes to marketing, but you do have to be consistent to get your word out there so that people can, find you very easily. I almost had a similar experience when people wanted to find my book on Barnes and Noble, and they couldn't find it because of my name. Now, my name is Gabriel Garcia, but on Barnes and Noble, if you type up Gabriel Garcia, you're not going to find me.
Garcia Marquez.
Yes, you're going to find him. And they had to scroll all the way down. It wasn't until my second book that people were able to find me a lot easier. And my third book, it popped up easily, but it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of practice. And that's another thing for authors is just, getting used to that side of being an author, the businessman and the marketer. And still on the topic of marketing, it's now time to look into the audience because that is very, very important. Now, for us authors, we are the target audience in the beginning because we know the story better than anyone else. But when it comes to publishing our work, we really have to consider, okay, who is the target audience for our works? And 9 times out of 10, you're going to hit a good majority. Sometimes not so much, maybe 80 or 70. Regardless, you want to hit that target audience for your works so that way they can be interested in it. Now, Scott, for you, looking back on Anton and your short stories, do you have a good idea of your audience? And in your opinion, when should the author take into consideration the audience when constructing their book?
Oh, that's a great question. For me, I'm interested in vampires. I'm not interested in dragons or ghosts or house possessions and a lot of the stuff that's popular. So, and then a lot of people will say vampires have been done to death, so why write it? You got to write what you're interested in.
Right.
So when it comes to marketing, I found, like I said, I have a wide range of people that are interested. People interested in action. Also, people that are interested in art and are attracted to the covers of my books. So I basically write with the desire to communicate what's inside of me, and hopefully somebody will connect with it. As you mentioned, we are not in this to get rich. If I was to rely solely on what I make from writing, it would be interesting.
Yes.
So, all I can say is we write what's inside us. If you try and do the fad or follow somebody else's example, your heart's probably not going to be into it, and it'll show in what you write. So I would just say write what interests you and let the chips fall where they may.
100% agree. And that leads to the follow-up question, which is a very important question among many others in this interview. And actually, again, shout out to Eric Bowden for this question because it's a really good one. When you constructed Anton and developing the world that Anton exists in, as well as the lore, the world building, and honing your craft, as you mentioned in your bio, you're inspired by a lot of great authors from Bram Stoker, Steakley, Steakley and Marv Wolfman, among many others, have inspired you. At the end of the day, you are trying to showcase your individuality and your voice through just genre. As you said, people have argued that the vampire lore, vampire tales are dead. They're beaten to death. Why write anything more? Well, you can if you can create a story that's unique to not only just you, but to future readers. So ultimately, Scott, how have you been able to balance the two where you're showing reverence and respect to vampire tales of the past, but also showing your individuality through your own works to make the genre fresh and engaging for a new generation of readers?
Well, I think I take the vampire and I put him in settings where we really haven't seen him before. The one scene in The Strain with the half vampire, I forget his name. I watched The Strain too. I love that show.
Mhm.
But that's a outlier. There's not a whole lot of other vampire gladiators. So
Nope.
I went into it at a lot more depth. And my next book, which is going to be from a different publisher, is going to go back even further in time and explore kind of more like a Conan world. Hyperborean is, I forget the exact
Ooh.
phrase for it, but say like 10,000 years ago, dark sorcery and monsters, kind of like a Robert E. Howard feel. So basically, I'm going to go into a setting where you really haven't seen vampires before. So I think that keeps it fresh. I'm not doing uh, dark castles and gothic stuff all the time. My stories all over the place in the Wild West, Victorian England, to basically Hyperborean world, even some in space. So I try and keep it fresh, even if my mythology is. I try and follow a little bit of the Bram Stoker mythology, which kind of gets ignored today. Like I'm not a huge fan of vampires burning up in sunlight, just like somebody opens a window and they crisp up. If you read Stoker's novel, Dracula could actually move in the daylight. He just didn't have any powers. So I like to explore that kind of a take on it. And also, when you stake my vampires, you just immobilize them. You don't kill them. And that was the way it was in the Stoker book too. So even if I'm semi following an old mythology, people don't recognize it because they're used to the Buffy take on things.
That's actually very, very true. And also with Abigail, the newest vampire story, the Voyage, I forgot the
Voyage of the
recent,
Demeter.
yeah, Voyage of the Meter, which was a short passage in Bram Stoker's about how Dracula got to the mainland, and of course Van Helsing and so many more. Like as you said, they followed the new add-ons to the vampire mythology, that a stake to the heart is the only thing that can kill them. Holy water is another thing that can harm them. Sunlight, all these things we've come to accept. But if you go back, as you said, Scott, to the beginnings of vampire lore and mythology, that's not really the case. So it is very fascinating. And also the idea of vampires in space, I'm really intrigued of how that plays out, because I really, really want to learn more about that. So I'll definitely stay up to date with
Well,
your social
well,
media
here,
on that.
Gabriel, just 1 second. Imagine you're in deep, dark space. It's cold. There's no air, and you're in a metal box with a vampire and no wood.
Well,
Kind of scary.
you're dead. You are absolutely going to die. And oh man, there are so many avenues you can go with that, but that will be saved for a future interview down the road. Now, going back to what you mentioned earlier about readers, as you said, your readership is, very, very vast and diverse. It's very, very important to really understand who your readers are. And sometimes it's more important than the audience. Yes, you want to target your specific audience, but within that audience, there are certain readers that you really want to market towards. Because at the end of the day, it's these readers that are going to pick up your book. As an example, I had two guests on the show who co-authored a graphic novel called Nuclear Power, where it imagines the Cuban Missile Crisis going completely wrong. And what happens is that the United States gets completely obliterated, save for the original 13 colonies that emerge from the ashes to become the American Union, governed by the Joint Chiefs of Staffs. And you have a nuclear wasteland dominating the rest of the United States. And what you have is now a totalitarian state taking over the American Union. Ultimately, as the authors say, pretty much the United States becomes this universe's Cuba in our timeline. And it's a very, very fascinating story. And they were writing for, fans of like X-Men, because there are mutants in this world due to the nuclear fallout. But surprisingly, a majority of their readers were people that grew up during the Cuban Missile Crisis, saying that you have written a story that probably almost would have happened, save for the mutants and superpowers, of course, but the fallout and what would have happened, this is probably the closest that we would have gotten. So for you, Scott, were you surprised by your readership in the sense that you gained readers that you were not initially trying to market towards?
Yeah, basically, I've had at the conventions, I've had all sorts of people from all sorts of backgrounds, all sorts of ages come up and tell me that they've read the book since the last time they've seen me, and they were absorbed in it and found it fascinating. So that just reinforces my desire to create, because I'm reaching audiences I never even imagined would be interested in the book.
Definitely. And as an add-on to that, again, talking about readership, it's also important to make sure that your prose writing matches the age group you're trying to market towards. Because I'm sure you definitely will agree, Scott, that there are certain books when they're stated or slated as either, in a case, let's go with young adult, because that's a very good example. Upon reading books that are young adult, you realize they needed a little bit more peer revision, and they're not really young adult. They are more new adult or even adult fiction. So for you, Scott, I think I kind of get the answer to this question, but where would you classify your stories? And was that difficult in the sense of trying to get your readers to market to those readers?
Mine basically are a mix of dark fantasy and horror. Uh, there's a lot of vampire violence, so it's not marketed to young children. It's for adults, and basically, the input I've got has been all the way from people in their late teens, early 20s, all the way into their 60s. So as far as when I write it, who it's geared towards, it's geared towards what I want to communicate about what's inside of me. And fortunately, I found an audience for that. And I don't really tailor it to one demographic or another. I just put what's inside me in print and hope that it finds an audience. And so far, it seems to be doing better than I had anticipated.
Awesome. And that leads to probably my favorite question in the interview, which I'll give context to in just a moment. And that is this, Scott. So, doing podcasting for now almost 2 years on YouTube, but 3 years on Spotify's podcasting platform, I've come to learn from the various authors that I've interviewed, now totaling up to almost 100 authors within 5 years, which is incredible. I've learned that there are two paths for authors: to be an author and to be known as an author. And for me, to be an author is an individual dedicated to the art of storytelling and honing one's craft and not being motivated solely by capital. But let's be honest, for us authors and creators, it's nice to get a little money here and there. To be known as an author, the second path is an individual dedicated to the art of marketing, showcasing their work, going on shows, podcasts to get the word out about their books, and trying to establish their brand, which is another thing to talk about. For us authors, when we create our books, we are building our brand. And what I've come to realize is that for first-time authors especially, the second path is the most enticing, but it leads to a lot of unrealistic goals down the road. And that can lead to authors no longer being motivated by their passion to write, but instead being motivated by trends, clicks, cliches in the publishing world, because that's what's selling. And I've come to this conclusion with the help of other authors is that in the publishing world, there's no guarantee your first book is going to be the start of your legacy or give you the gratification you are looking for. There are exceptions to that rule, of course. There are authors whose first works did give them that status. That's no easy feat to do, and they deserve all their credit. But generally speaking, for first-time authors, you have this roller coaster of highs and lows. And as I said before, that can lead to unrealistic goals, and the passion, the drive that a person has for writing goes down the drain because they're no longer motivated to hone their craft to create stories. They're now motivated by the gravy train in the publishing world, what's clicking in the publishing world. So, Scott, I would like to hear your thoughts on this, that there is no guarantee in the publishing world that your first book is going to give you the gratification that you want or begin your legacy, but it should not deter you from being a storyteller if that's truly something you want to do.
Yeah, for me, this is just a passionate hobby. It's an important part of my life, but it's not all of my life. I came to it later in my life, and basically, I'm fortunate to have people that are interested in what I write, but I can't, like we talked about, I can't market what is not inside me. So if I keep my horizons relative and realize that this is just a hobby and I'll have successes and lots of failures, then I don't get super disappointed. You know, if I set my sights and I want to be the next Stephen King, that's very unrealistic and I'll be very disappointed. But if I keep my goals relative, you know, learning from my failures and learning how to market the books, the next one I'll know more, and I'll be doing more podcasts, more conventions, and learn better places to place ads, all stuff I had no idea about 2 years ago.
That is beautifully said, Scott. And also to add to that, you know, grit becomes talent as time goes on. If you want to be known as, you know, a good author or to be an author, It just takes time of honing your craft and really showcasing your work, because it may be your 10th, maybe your 20th, or your 25th book that gets your name out there to the masses. And it's from that book that gets you the title, or maybe not the title, but allows you to achieve the goals that you set out for in the beginning initially. Because at that point, you can say, hey, if you enjoyed these books, check out my other ones, and you get a whole new generation of readers and fans who are now going to read your work. Because, as I shared with another guest on the show, ultimately our works are going to outlive us, as they said. Our works are going to outlive us when we're gone. That's why we have all of these great stories from the past, like Bram Stoker's Dracula, Frank Herbert's Dune, C.S. Lewis's Narnia, and J.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. These stories will still inspire future readers as time goes on. And that's all we can do going forward. And again, with the gloominess, but I feel it's appropriate because this is on vampires, so it kind of does fit. But as we near the end of this interview, there are two final questions, Scott, that I did want to ask you and hear your thoughts on. So the first question is, we've talked about marketing, we talked about a little bit about branding and, writing what we write and what we love. But I also think it's important to talk about networking, because I feel now more than ever, the internet has allowed a lot of authors to network with other authors and interact with other communities that, have been able to grow and expand. So for you, Scott, are there any authors that you'd like to give a special mention to who have helped you understand the industry a little bit better?
Well, I've had help. Not sure you consider them authors per se, but with my first book, I got a nice blurb from the publisher of Weird Book named Douglas Draw, who's very well known in the horror, weird fiction industry for his expertise in all things weird fiction. So I appreciate his help. I appreciate Margaret Carter, who is an author, and she was the publisher of Vampire's Crypt that got me started. Also to my publishers, Catherine Emily at Input Output, Stephen Pajic and Robert Sargent at Sinister Smile. They're both authors as well as editors and artists, and I wouldn't be where I'm at now if I hadn't had some help from them. And then, honestly, two other ones I got a shout out to. My mother, Rebecca Harper, is no longer with us. She was an English teacher in high school, and she was always very attentive to my writing and would give me little hints and definitely a lot of grammar punctuation. And then finally, my wife, Esperanza, who guts it out and goes to these conventions with me and helps me set up the booth, set up the books, and answers all the questions people have. So not necessarily authors, but those are people. Oh, and one other, I don't know if I told you, Gabriel, I do, on the side, I do write horror comics from my friend Kevin Glover at Scary Tales Publishing. It's real quick. This is the latest. I don't even know if you can see it. It's hard to see. It's called Creature Feature Comics.
Ooh,
so Kevin
nice.
has been nice enough to do some blurbs for my books. So I'd shout out to him too.
Awesome. Awesome, Scott. That's really, really cool. And thank you actually for showing the comic. I know was a little blurry, but
Yeah, sorry.
just from what you mentioned, yeah, that is, very, very cool. And now arriving at the final question of this interview, Scott, here it is. With everything you've learned thus far in your journey as an author, from the interactions you've had with your readers and helping to build your voice as an author with the help of your publishers and editors of input output. What is your word of wisdom to other authors wanting to get a head start in this industry?
I would say write every day. When you're starting, just write like 500 words. Go back the next day, go over and edit it. As there's a lot of times you get excited and think you're pouring out the greatest stuff, that you're an Emerson, and you look at it and it's not so great. But try and write every day. I think Stephen King, in his book on writing, and this is many years ago, he was writing 2,000 words a day. So write every day, even if it's not good. You can always edit it the next day. And then keep an eye out for the websites where you can get your stuff published, like Horror Tree, Duotrope. There's places on Facebook. You can go to forums and start plugging away. Submit your work. See if people like it. And if they don't like it, learn what you can, submit it somewhere else. If it's what's the word? Honest, at some point somebody else will want to read it. So just keep at it.
Definitely. And also to add on to that, and thank you to Sabrina for mentioning this in her interview, write what you're afraid of. And by that, I mean, write what you are not comfortable in writing. So if you are a fantasy writer, but you want to try your hand at, thriller or noir, go for it. There's nothing stopping you. And you never know. You may find out that you are also a good noir writer as well as a fantasy writer. Never ever pigeonhole yourself into one genre. Yes, write what you love to write, but also write what you're afraid of, because you never know. You never know what you're capable of unless you push yourself. And with that, viewers and listeners, we have now come to the end of this amazing author interview here on the show. I want to give a huge thank you to Mr. Scott Harper for coming on and telling us all about Anton and his short stories and other works we can expect from him down the road. Now, Scott, before we end this interview, where can people find you on social media as well as purchase your short stories and Anton?
Yeah, all the books are available on Amazon. I have a website, Scott Harper, macabmaestro.com. Macabre Maestro is kind of my AKA nom de plume. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, and X, and Threads. So you can find me on all those. Send me a message. The books are easiest to buy on Amazon. They're on Barnes & Noble too.
Awesome. I will link all those down below in the description of this video. And again, my viewers and listeners, thank you so much for joining us for another author interview here on the channel. And a huge thank you to Scott for coming on the show, making his official debut. And I promise you, this will not be the last we will see Scott. Who knows? When he comes out with another book, as he's mentioned in this interview, he has some ideas for other stories. When those are out, or even if they're still in the early stages, we will definitely have Scott back on the show to tell us a little bit more. So be on the lookout for that interview. And also be on the lookout for a book impressions episode on Anton, because I will be doing a book impressions on that book very soon. So be on the lookout for that. And as always, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And let us know down below, what is your favorite vampire story or movie? Or what do you think could be added to the vampire mythos and lore? Comment down below. And as always, this is the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill signing out, wishing you all a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are in the world.